Hello, this is Alan Elliott, and this is SAS Essentials, Mastering SAS for Data Analytics, 3rd edition. In this Chapter 4, Part 2, Preparing Data for Analysis, we're going to be looking at the set statement, PROC sort, appending and merging datasets, using PROC format, and finding the first and last values in a group. As we discussed earlier, to do the hands-on examples, please download the data from this location. Let's get started. Section 4.5 is using the set statement to read an existing data set. Suppose you have a big data set you want to use and to modify it. The thing is, you typically don't want to mess with the original data set. You want to modify a copy of it. Oftentimes the original data set is from some place where you've gathered it and you don't, it could be downloaded from a corporate or governmental site. Or maybe you've collected the data and this is your original data set. You don't want to really mess with the information in the original data set. Always use a modified copy to modify your data set. And the way to do that in SAS is by using the set statement. And it's very simple. You say data, whatever you want your new data set to be named, semicolon, set, whatever the old name is. So here's two examples of that. Data new set old and data new set, and you can use the Windows folder file information as well. So taking an old data set or a current data set, basically copying it into a new data set, and then you can manipulate the new data set. Here's another way of looking at that. So let's say you have data from a data set called all, A-L-L, all. And we're going to send that data to a data set called males using the set command, but we're going to limit it to M records, which are the male records. And so we're going to result in a smaller data set containing only males. So we started with a large data set, all. We instructed SAS to only use the data that we were interested in this case males, and so we ended up with a smaller data set. Here's the code to do something similar to that. So you'll notice here it says data males set all. So we begin with the data set called all. We create a new data set called males, and we use the if statement to limit the data that is stored in males if gender equal M. In the same way, we could make another data set, data females set all, if gender equal F. So now we have two different data sets, male and females, that we can manipulate. And we both got them, we got both data sets from the original data set named all. Here's another example. Let's say you download a data set from, again, corporate or governmental resource, and you want to modify it. Again, you don't want to modify the original data set. So you copy it. In this case, we're going to say data my-SAS-live.study. So we're creating a permanent data set called study in my-SAS-live from a data set in my-SAS-live.gov. So we've taken the data from a governmental data set and copied it into a study data set that we can now manipulate. And we're going to start manipulating it right now. So one of the things we're going to do is work on missing values. And oftentimes when you download a database, it comes with a dictionary or a description of the variables and their meanings in the data set, and oftentimes, particularly with governmental data sets, they'll have a list of the missing value codes they used. So in this case, they used -9 when age was not known. So we say if age equal -9, then age equal dot. If SBP equal -99, then SBP equal dot. So there may be a number of these recodes that you'd want to do in your new data set to make it so that you can do analysis and so forth. Another thing you want to maybe do is calculate body mass index. So here we have BMI equal weight, and you can see the calculation there, and so forth and so on. So what you're doing is all of this information, all of these changes that you're making to the copy of the data set and not to the original data set. Let's do hands-on example 4.8. In this case, open the file called d_3.sas, and you can see the code there. Again, we've seen this code before, but we're going to take a data set called all and create a data set called males by only selecting gender equal M. There are some other steps in this example, and I encourage you to complete the example as shown in the text. Let's look at section 4.6 using PROC sort. The PROC sort procedure is used to rearrange the observation in a SAS dataset or to create a new SAS dataset containing the rearranged observations. The sorting sequence is shown here. It's the typical Windows sorting sequence you'd find in any Windows program. One note, notice that the dot occurs before the numbers, so missing values then will always occur before numeric values. And the default way that the sort works is ascending, although we'll look at how descending will work in just a moment. The syntax for PROC sort is PROC sort and then options, a semicolon, and then one or more by variables. Common options that you might put in here are data equal dataset name, that tells you where the data is coming from that you want to sort, and then out equal is the output database where you want to put the results. For instance, here is a quick program. PROC sort data equal my data, so the data is coming from my data. Out equal msort says that you're going to create a data set called msort, and you're going to sort it by the variable named rectime. Let's look at the hands-on example 4.9. Open the program file dsort1.sas, and you'll see the code here. And notice down in the PROC sort that we're creating an output file called S1, and we're sorting by the variable rectime. So we're reading from my data. We see that we created my data there. You can see the code. And then we're sorting and outputting to a file named S1. And then notice in PROC print, now we're going to print S1. And there are the results over at the right. And notice the sorted column where rectime goes from smallest to largest. Now let's do a little exercise here. Change the out name to S2 and then include the word descending before rectime. So what this does is now we're going to output to the work file called S2, and it's going to be descending instead of ascending, which is the default. So if you make those changes and then run, you should see the following results. So you can see now that rectime, or the data are sorted by rectime, with rectime largest being the first to show up in the data set. There's some additional data steps. Go to the text and complete this example to get all of the information. Now, let's do example 4.10. This is another example of sort where we're going to also do a keep and rename within the sort statement. So we looked at keep earlier. We haven't seen rename yet, but here's an example of how to use it. So we're going to PROC sort. We're going to sort the data set called SumData. We're going to output the results to a file called analysis. And then within parentheses, and before a semicolon, we say keep equal ID, group, gender, and age. And then rename equal, and then in other parentheses, ID equal subject, age equal DXH. What this is going to do is it's going to change the name of the variable called ID to subject and change the name age to DXH, so like diagnosis age. Then we're going to print the results. Now you can see here the before and after result. So the original file had a number of variables in it, and then after we sort and rename, we can see that the variable called ID is now subject, and we have a new variable name called DXAge. Let's look at appending and merging data sets. Appending adds new records to an existing data set, sometimes called a vertical merge, And merging is a horizontal merge that adds variables to the data set. So be careful with this. So appending adds records to a data set, whereas merging adds variables to a data set. We'll see that in the upcoming examples. So appending is accomplished by including multiple dataset names in the set statement. For example, data new, set old one, old two. That means that you're going to append old one and old two together to create a new dataset called new. You can append many datasets. So here's an example where you have multiple datasets, all appended one after another to create the new dataset called new. Here's an example. Open the file called dappend1. And we see that there are two data sets here, old 1 and old 2. They both have the same variables, notice, subject, age, and years smoked. So what we want to do is combine these data sets. Maybe one was taken at one place and another was taken at another place, or two different times, whatever it was. But we want to now append them, and we can see that we can do that by the code on the right, data new, set old 1, old 2. And this is what the result looks like. So we can see the first four records come from the first data set, and then the second four come from the second data set. I want to make a note here that if one of those data sets had another variable that wasn't in the other data set, for instance, let's say the first one had a married variable, yes, no, or something like that, but the second data set didn't, then we would see a married column and information in the first four records, but then the next four records, it would all be missing. So take a look at the additional steps in this hands-on example and complete it as it is in the text. Now let's look at merging data sets by a key identifier. A key identifier is some sort of variable like a number, subject, or a patient number, something like that. It needs to be unique for each person. For instance, your credit card number is an ID number, and you may use your credit card in a number of locations, and your information is going to appear in a number of data sets. And so how do they bring it all together so that they can bill you at the end of the month? Well, they merge the data sets in a similar way that we're going to see here. So let's take a look at that. There's two steps to a merge: sort first and then merge. So first we have to sort each database by or data set by the key identifier. And then within the data step, we want to use the merge statement along with a by statement to merge the two data sets into one. So here's an example. First we have two data sets, one called pre and one called post. Maybe this is data we saw for patients who came into a clinic for a pre-check and then a post-check. So we have these two data sets, and we want to merge them together. But in both data sets we have something called case, their case number. So we have by case in both instances. And then we have data pre-post, where we're merging pre and post in by case. So here's an example of that. And you can open up the file dmerge1.sas to see this example. We have data pre, and we have the case, and then a variable called pre-treatment. And in the second data set called post, we have case and a different variable called post-treatment. Now notice here there's two different variables, pre-treat and post-treat. Now we do a PROC sort on each one. So by case, the second one doesn't have the by case there, but it should. And then what we do is in the data step, we merge pre and post, then by case. And while we're at it, we're going to create a new variable called diff that's post-treatment minus pre-treatment. So we can do a number of things here. Once we've merged the data sets, this is the place where you might want to do additional calculations related to now the data set that's been merged. And then finally, we're going to print out the results. So here are the results. Notice here we have the data set pre, and the 1.02 comes from the first data set, and the 1.94 comes from the second data set. So we can see where that now appears in the new data set. And then the column called diff is the difference that we calculated when we did the merge. Now I want to make a note here just real quickly that again, the calculation needs to appear in the data step where you did the merge. So notice down below, data pre-post, merge, and then diff equal post-treatment minus pre-treatment. All that appears before any run statement. It all has to be within the data paragraph. We can also, just like we did in appending, we can rename variables while we're merging in a similar way. So here's an example where I'm creating a new data set called new data set, merging data 1, data 2, and data 3, and actually data 4. But for data 3, I'm going to rename some variables. Old name equal new name, and then I'm also going to drop some variables or keep some variables. So in a similar way that we saw in appending. Here's a real example of that where I have data pre-post and I'm merging pre, and within the pre data set I'm going to rename the variable that was called pre-treat. I'm going to rename it baseline. So the variable name is going to become baseline in the new data set called pre-post. Now let's look at a few to many merge. A few to many merge is used when you have records in one data set that you want to merge into some table that typically contains a smaller number of categories. Here's an example. Suppose you have an auto parts store. You sell products to several kinds of buyers, and each type of buyer gets a different discount. You want to produce a report that shows the amount of actual sales price that was charged for a number of purchases. So here we have two data sets. The first data set is the data of the items that were sold. Here we have a carb cleaner, cost $2.30 and it was sold to a repair shop. A belt that was sold to a consumer, and so forth. And then we have a few data set, and this contains the actual items that we're going to sell. Or I'm sorry, this contains the discount types. So we have buyer type, consumer, repair, and store. So we have three different kinds of people that come in. One gets a 0% discount, one gets a 33% discount, and one gets a 40% discount. Now, we need to define these in our data sets here. So we're going to have data type, and we're going to format buyer type just so that, because the buyer type may be more than 8 characters long. And we're going to input buyer type and the discount. So we're creating this, this is the few data set, so we're creating that. And then we're also going to create the sales data set. And again, we're formatting some items just to make sure they fit correctly. So buyer type should have the same format as it did in the previous one. In this case, we're inputting the item, the buyer type, and the original price. Now, we're going to sort both of these data sets by buyer type, as we need to do before we do a merge. And then we create a new report or a new data set called report, where we're going to merge sales and type by buyer type. And just like we did in the previous example, we're going to use this opportunity to create some new variables, in this case a variable called final. It's going to be the final price that somebody paid for an item. And we're using some calculations here and some SAS functions, the round function that's going to round off whatever this number is. The 0.01 says round it off to 2 decimal places. And then we're going to print the report. So here we get the final report, and you can see the results. So a belt was bought by a consumer for $6.99. They got 0% discount, so it cost $6.99. Let's go down to the carb cleaner was bought by a repair shop. It would cost $2.30. It had a 33% discount, so they really paid $1.54 and so forth. So we get the price on the shelf and also the final price that we got for each item. So let's review this. So we have, you can stop here and try to fill in these blanks, but so we did the proc sort on the first one, data sales, similar kind of proc sort on the second one, the data type. We're going to merge the data sets by the same variable that we used for sorting. And then we're going to do a proc print. Now, the one thing we haven't seen yet, we saw it earlier in an earlier tutorial, is the sum option. And we want to sum the final price so that we can, which is going to produce a number that tells us the total of the price, the total of the sales. All right, so here's the data filled in. Hopefully you got all that right. And here's the final result if we run that program. It's the same we saw earlier. The only difference is at the very bottom we see the sum. So from all of these sales, we've made a total of $67. You might also sum the price column just to see. That might be a comparison of two values. And again, there's some additional things you can do, some steps in the text that you might follow to get more out of this particular example. Now let's look at PROC format. The PROC format procedure allows you to create your own custom formats. Now these formats allow you to specify information that will be displayed for selected values of a variable. Now we saw formats earlier. For instance, we saw date formats where we could take a date and display it in various kinds of ways, either as a short date or a date that includes the week date and all that. So those are pre-created formats that are in SAS, but now we're going to create our own formats. And so that's what we're going to do here. And we're going to create them for variables that we have used in our own particular data sets. So for instance, let's say we have a data set where disease is coded as 0, 1. Well, that's pretty cryptic and we don't know exactly what that means. So we format that so that instead of a 1 appearing in our report or a 0, 0 is going to mean diseased and 1 is going to be not diseased, so that we can differentiate in English really what the values mean that we've collected. The way we do that is we have to create a format first. So we use the PROC format statement to create a format. So in this case, we have the format, we're called format married. Now, FMT married is something that you make up yourself. I always like to put the prefix FMT to a format just to remind me that this is a format. It's not required, it's just something that I think helps you in the long run. So I'm going to create a format called FMT married, and 0 is going to be no, and 1 is going to be yes. Now what does that do? That means that when we create a report, instead of a 0 appearing in our report, the word no will appear, and instead of a 1, yes will appear. So that makes it much more readable. And then we're also going to create a character kind of format. So the one we created was a number format. A character format, you put a $sign before the name, so $, FMT name 2. And notice here that the left-hand side of the equal sign is in quotes. So let's say you have M and F. So you have M equal male, F equal female, for instance. Now, make sure you understand the difference here. At the top is a number format, and notice the number 1, number 2 are not in quotes. But at the bottom, where we're formatting a text value, they are in quotes. This is a common mistake. So make sure you understand the difference between these two ways of creating a format. All right, so here we've created some formats here. 1, format married, 0 equal no, 1 equal yes, and then a character one, $, FMT gender, where M equal male, F equal female. Let's do hand-on example 4.14. So we're going to open up the file called dformat1.sas, and here you see the code. And we've seen these formats before. We create these formats, and then we have to assign the formats to the program, so to the procedure. So here I have proc print, data survey, and I have some variables I want it to output. And then I want it to use this format I've created on the variable called married. So I have format married, FMT married dot. Now it's important that that dot appears because that tells SAS this is a format. And so notice now that SAS can tell the difference between a variable name, married, and a format name, FMT married dot. And so that dot is very important. And it also gives you a hint that you've done it right by making it a different color in the editor. So if I run that program, I notice that the column married then has yes and no's in it instead of 0s and 1s. Now let's learn how we did the column called gender. We use that by doing within the PROC format. We have the $FMT gender. We've seen that before. And now at the bottom, the format statement, married, format married dot, gender, format gender dot. So we can apply as many formats as we want within the format statement in the PROC print. So here's the program where we've created the format first, and typically that's at the top of your program, and then you apply it within a procedure. So here within PROC print, we have applied the formats married and gender, and then we see the output married and gender. Now there are other ways to specify formats, and we can use ranges for formats, and this isn't all the ones we can use, but it shows you some examples of other ways you can do it. And there are more efficient ways for some of these. I'm just showing them to you as examples. So let's say we have age and we want to classify it into 4 different categories. The lowest age through 12 we're going to call child, and then 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 we're going to call teen, 20 through 59 is adult, and 60 through high is senior. And another way we can assign formats is that we can assign many formats using a single format statement. So for instance, let's say we've coded Q1, Q2, and Q5 and Q7 using a format called FMTYN. Now notice the format statement below. We have Q1, Q5, Q7, FMTYN. That format statement now applies to all 3 of those variables, not just the Q7, but all 3 of them. So we can assign the same format to a number of variables at the same time. So let's look at hands-on example 4.15. Open up the program file dformat2, and we see now that we have a PROC format at the top of our program where we are assigning a format called FMT age and one called FMT stat. This is socioeconomic status, and we can see we have five values of that, and we have our age values that we've assigned. Now down where we use PROC print, we're going to assign those formats using the format statement. So age, FMT age dot, status, FMT stat dot. So again, remember we have to assign them 2 parts, create the format and assign the format. Now there's other steps in this example. I encourage you to do the ones that are in the text. All right, so let's look at what the difference is between assigning a format within a PROC that we've seen and in dataset. So the first example is the one we've seen up to this point, PROC print, where we assign format gender equal FMT gender. Now, the thing you need to know is this format assignment is only valid within that procedure. So if we do another procedure later on, it will not remember that assignment. So it won't remember the gender is FMT gender dot. But if we assign it within a data step, down below, data, my data set, old data, and then a format statement, format gender, FMT gender dot. Now, whenever we use my data from now on, that format statement is remembered. So it becomes a permanent part of that data set. And if that data set is a permanent data set, then the format, again, is stored within that permanent data set. Now, let's talk about creating permanent formats. So we created them within a data set that was permanent, but let's say we have a bunch of formats and we want to store them all in some sort of library. We can do that using this PROC format statement. So PROC format library, we're going to say we're going to assign a library. In this case, we're going to use my SAS lib dot whatever name we want to choose. If we don't choose a name, SAS will just use the word format there. My SAS lib dot format. Okay, so here's an example. PROC format library equal my SAS lib, and as I mentioned, that's going to create a library called my SAS lib dot formats. And we're going to assign 2 formats, format married and format gender, as we've seen before. Now what this does is it creates 2 subfolders in the my SAS lib dot formats library folder that are going to be under those 2 names. We'll see what that means. So now there's a formats folder. So in Explorer, if you go to my SAS lib dot formats and double click on it, then you will see these 2 icons. And these 2 icons tell you that we have created 2 formats within that library. one called format married and one called format gender. I can also click on one of them. For instance, if I click on format married, I'll see the details about that format. And if you look at start 01 and label no, yes, it tells you the values that are assigned to each of the labels that are assigned to each of those values. Okay, now once we've created a library, we have to be able to tell SAS somehow where is that library, and we do that with an options statement. So this option statement typically appears at the top of our program code, and we say options FMT search equal whatever our PROC Live name is named, and that tells SAS what library to use when we reference a format somewhere in our program. So here's an example. Options format search equal mysaslive.format. So I'm telling it, okay, use the formats in the library called mysaslive.formats. And now I do a proc print, and notice here I can now use those formats called FMT married and FMT gender. Let's say I exited SAS and came back into it, but I still have that formats directory out there. I don't have to recreate them using PROC format. Once I've created them, stored in my library, now I can just use them forever. So what happens if you don't remember where your formats are or what's in the format library? You can, of course, go out to your Explorer and double click on things, but you can also do a PROC format catalog equal mysaslive formats and then contents. And what that will do is it will create a report for you that tells you what formats you've created. So in this case, it tells us I have format married and format gender in my formats library. Let's do example 4.16. So open up the program file called dformat3.sas. Here's the code. And in this code, I'm going to, first I'm creating a library called mysaslive. I don't have to do that if I already have that library created. Hopefully, as you're going through this book, you already have it created. So the first line is not really necessary. But let's look at then the rest. PROC format library equal mysaslive.cat1. So that says, okay, create a new library called cat1 and put in that library format married and format gender and then run. So what that's going to do, we did it earlier for the one called mysaslive.format. This is just a second example to show you how to do it again. In this case, we're creating a catalog called cat1. And you see down there at the bottom right, then the contents become format married and format gender. And then again, once I've created that, I can use them forever. Now, what if your SAS format library is missing? Now, when this happens, a scenario where I see this happening a lot is if you're sharing data sets with other people, or if you download a data set from, again, your corporate site or maybe the government or some other site. They've created a SAS data set with some data in it, but they may have created their own SAS library and they didn't or forgot to send you that library. And so you have a data set, but you don't have the library that's associated with it. And in that case, you try to read the data set, and it gives you this error message. It says the format FMT married was not found or could not be loaded. So this data set thought that it had a format called FMT married, but it couldn't find one. So what do you do if you don't have the library associated with the data set? There's a way to overcome that, and the way to do that is at the top of your program, enter options no FMT ERR. That tells SAS to ignore the formats and just report the values as they originally were, not the formatted values. Okay, at this point, let's just briefly talk about the difference between a format and a label, because I see people making this error quite a bit as they're beginning to use SAS. A label labels is a description for variables. So label age equal age in 2013, for instance. That gives a label to the variable called age. And so in my report, a column name may be age in 2013. That's the name of the variable. Whereas a format is the name of the values within a variable. So FMT married 0, 1, 0, no, 1, yes. assigns values to the 0 and the 1 within the data for the variable, in this case we use called married. So make sure you understand the difference between those two and don't get them mixed up. Okay, let's look at this new example called finding the first and last values in a data set. In this example, we're going to find the first and last values of a variable called GP group, and we're going to call them first.group and last.group. That's going to be the name of the variables, or the way that we're going to identify the first and the last within the variable called group. So here's how we do that. Open up the data set called defindFirst.SAS, and here's the code. So we're creating a data set called first from the library called, or from the data set called SumData. Now notice here that we have a by statement, by GP. Now notice this is not a proc sort or anything, but we have to use that by GP statement within the data step before the if statement, so that the if statement here, which is going to group the data, is going to work. So we say if first.gp, so that means if the first value of GP, if this is the first value of GP or group, then assign a new variable called which ID as is first. So what we're doing is we're creating a new variable called which ID, and we're only assigning it the value is first if it's the first one. And if it's the last one, we're going to assign it is last. Now this is going to allow us to identify the first and last value within this column, within this variable called GP. And so I'm going to print out the results of the variable ID, GP, and which ID. And we'll see the results here. So here are the results. And so we can see when I print this data set out, we have created a column called which ID. And notice here that the first record that it sees for group A, it assigns is first. And then the last of the A's, it assigns is last. And then it starts all over again for B. Now this is most valuable when GP has been sorted, but it will try to do it otherwise. So it's going to find the first and last, identify the first and last values within the variable that we're talking about, in this case group. So again, record 101 was the first one, record 561 was the last one within the group A. Okay, that's the end of this chapter. We're going to continue with chapter 5 in preparing data to use for SAS procedures. Thank you for watching. I hope this tutorial was helpful to you. If it was, please like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.